let's unpack this. We actually spent a massive amount of time on this show looking at these really sweeping, world-changing events. We decode complex technological systems, we unravel grand historical narratives, and we usually ask you to look outward at the massive structures shaping our society.
All right. The big picture stuff.
Exactly the big picture. But today, we are going completely in the opposite direction. We're asking you to look inward at something so microscopic, so deeply embedded in your daily life that you probably use it 100 times a day without even a second thought. Our source material today is an English language guide.
Which sounds...
Specifically, a very unassuming document titled Accidents, Mirrors, and Reflexive Pronouns.
And I know what you, the listener, might be thinking right now. A grammar guide. Really, it sounds like we are about to subject you to a really dry academic lecture on sentence diagramming, but I assure you we are absolutely not doing that.
Not even close. Our mission today is to explore how the English language relies on these highly specific, almost invisible tiny words to handle some of the most complex, conceptual heavy lifting the human brain can do. We are talking about the architecture of self-reflection.
Yeah.
We are going to decode the mechanics of self-referential language to understand how we actually communicate our relationship with ourselves. Like, how do we take the concept of personal responsibility or deep physical isolation or mutual collaborative interaction and compress all of that into a single two-syllable pronoun.
What's fascinating here is that the text we are analyzing is technically classified as a B1 level guide, meaning it's designed for intermediate language learners.
Right.
Its stated purpose is purely practical. But when you bypass the pedagogical surface and examine the conceptual mechanics it's trying to teach, you uncover an incredibly rich philosophical framework. The text forces the reader to confront how we linguistically separate an action inflicted upon ourselves from an action shared with others. It essentially maps out the hidden geometry of human agency.
I'm so glad you brought up the idea of a framework, because to teach this framework, the authors of this guide make a very specific and honestly, a wildly dramatic choice right out of the gate.
They really do.
They don't start with abstract philosophy, they put us right in the kitchen. The very first section of the vocabulary centers entirely around physical accidents. If you are reading along with us, you'll see the primary verbs introduced are to cut, emphasizing the continuous action of cutting with a knife, and then to burn, focusing on the past states of being burned or burnt on a stove, and then just the overarching verb to hurt.
It's a striking pedagogical choice, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you want to force someone to understand the boundary between the self and the outside world, you introduce pain. Pain is the ultimate clarifying agent.
Yeah, that's true.
Think about it. If you are just walking through your house, you aren't constantly aware of the exact dimensions of your physical form. But the second you stub your toe, or in the case of this text, cut your finger, your awareness snaps entirely to the site of the injury. You are instantly, acutely aware of where you end, and the sharp edge of the world begins.
I was actually making dinner a few nights ago, just rushing through chopping some vegetables, and I nicked my thumb. Nothing serious, but in that split second, your entire universe shrinks down to that 1 millimeter of skin.
Exactly.
And the source text perfectly captures that chaotic state by introducing the concept of being clumsy. The definition provided in the text is brilliantly simple. It's dropping things or having accidents often. But if you really sit with that idea, being clumsy is a deeply weird existential state.
It is.
Your brain issues a command like chop the onion, but your physical body stages a rebellion and chops your thumb instead. You are simultaneously the perpetrator of the violence and the victim of it.
That duality is the absolute crux of the matter. Clumsiness represents a temporary dissolution of the mind-body connection. Your intention and your reality fall out of sync. But what I find even more compelling in the source material is what happens immediately after the clumsy act.
A psychological shift.
Right. The text moves us from the physical verbs, cut, burn, hurt, directly to a new phrase, to blame oneself. It explicitly defines this as the act of saying, it is my fault.
That is a massive leap. We go from dropping a physical plate on the floor to carrying the psychological weight of the broken plate.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this transition from the physical kitchen accident to internalizing the fault provides the perfect runway for why reflexive pronouns are an absolute grammatical necessity. Consider the problem language has to solve here. Most of our verbs are designed to project outward.
Like pushing or pulling.
Exactly. I throw the ball, you drive the car. The subject exerts force onto an external object. But how do you express the psychological state of guilt?
You can't just project it outward. If I say I blame, the immediate question is who? The verb is left hanging in midair, looking for a target.
Precisely. If our language only allowed us to point outward, we would have no way to articulate this internal state of accountability. We need a specialized linguistic tool that allows the subject of the sentence to simultaneously act as the object of the sentence.
The closed loop.
Yes. We require a grammatical structure that allows us to be both the judge handing down the sentence and the defendant receiving it. That is the function of the reflexive pronoun. It is the mechanism that allows the human mind to step outside of itself, observe its own actions, and pass judgment.
Step outside of itself to pass judgment. That perfectly tees up the core grammatical lesson the source material introduces next, which it calls the mirror rule. This is where the guide moves from vocabulary into the actual mathematics of the grammar. The text states that with reflexive pronouns, the action reflects back entirely on the subject, exactly like a reflection in a mirror.
I would actually push back slightly on the text's metaphor there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because a mirror is a highly passive object. You stand in front of it and the light just bounces back. But the grammatical reality of these pronouns is much more active. It's a strict mathematical equation. Subject equals object.
Right.
The person generating the energy of the verb is the exact same person absorbing that energy. The action doesn't just passively reflect. It is actively forced to loop back onto its origin point. The energy of the verb never escapes the closed circuit of the individual.
That makes the warning the source text gives us so much more interesting. Let's look at how the text maps out the paradigm, starting with the first person singular. The rule dictates that I becomes myself. The example provided is, I see myself in the mirror. But right beneath that, the guide has a flashing neon warning sign for the reader. It explicitly states, never say, I see me.
And to anyone who grew up speaking English, I see me triggers an immediate, almost instinctual rejection. It sounds disjointed, perhaps something a toddler might say before they fully grasp the boundaries of their own identity. But let's critically examine why it breaks the rule so egregiously.
Because me is an object pronoun. It belongs on the receiving end of someone else's action. You see me, they hear me.
Yes, and by using an object pronoun, the underlying grammatical structure insists that the object is separate from the subject. Even if logically, factually, we know that the I looking and the me being looked at are the exact same biological organism, the grammar creates a schism.
A divide.
Exactly. If you force the phrase, I see me into a sentence, you are creating a bizarre, out-of-body psychological distance. You are treating your own reflection as a distinct, external, and entirely separate entity. You are alienating yourself from your own image.
It's almost dissociative. You're viewing yourself as a stranger, but the word myself acts like a conceptual glue.
Sure.
Collapses that unnatural distance and unifies the observer and the observed back into a single, cohesive human being.
It enforces psychological unity. The language is demanding that you take ownership of your reflection.
Let's carry that logic down the rest of the list the text provides, because the examples they chose aren't just random filler. They actually build on each other. For the second person, you becomes yourself. The example is a question, did you hurt yourself? This circles us right back to the physical accidents from the very beginning of the guide.
It does, but notice the subtle shift in empathy that the reflexive pronoun creates here. If I ask you, did you hurt your hand? The hand is almost treated as a separate object that suffered an event.
Like a piece of property that got damaged.
Precisely. But by asking, did you hurt yourself? The speaker is acknowledging the full scope of the clumsiness we discussed earlier. The speaker recognizes that you, the listener, are both the clumsy force that caused the accident and the physical victim suffering the consequence. It's a remarkably intimate way of inquiring about someone's well-being because it acknowledges their total agency in the situation, even the accidental agency.
That brings us to the third person feminine. She becomes herself. And the example the source provides here is quite a pivot. She taught herself French. We spent the first 10 minutes of this deep dive talking about pain, clumsiness, and self-blame. But this example proves that the closed loop of the reflexive pronoun isn't exclusively reserved for negative things or accidental self-destruction.
Not at all. In fact, this is where the reflexive pronoun transitions into a powerful vehicle for autonomy. Think about the verb to teach. The standard flow of that verb is from point A to point B. A teacher possesses knowledge and transfers it to a student. It is inherently a two-person operation.
Yeah.
But when you apply the mirror rule she taught herself, you internalize that entire power dynamic. She is simultaneously generating the instruction and receiving it. The mirror rule here isn't reflecting a chaotic accident. It's reflecting sheer self-reliance, discipline, and intellectual independence.
I really like that framing. It turns the closed circuit from a trap into an engine. Looking at the plurals, the text moves to the first-person plural. We becomes ourselves. The example given is we enjoyed ourselves. And the guide includes a helpful little note translating this as simply meaning we had fun. I find it fascinating that the English language requires this complex, looping grammatical structure just to express the mundane concept of a group having a good time at a party.
It points to a very specific quirk in how English conceptualizes pleasure. You can say we had fun, treating fun as an abstract commodity that the group acquired or experienced. But when you deploy the reflexive we enjoyed ourselves, the grammar fundamentally alters the source of the joy.
How so?
It implies that the group didn't need outside entertainment. The enjoyment was generated entirely within the closed loop of the group's own company. They are generating the pleasure and consuming it simultaneously. It's a completely self-sustaining emotional ecosystem.
And wrapping up the standard plurals, they becomes themselves with the example. They introduce themselves. Again, the action remains entirely contained within the boundaries of the subject group. But here's where it gets really interesting. You listening might have noticed that I skipped right over the third-person masculine singular, and I did that because the source text dedicates a significant amount of space to highlighting a massive trap hidden right in the middle of this paradigm.
The infamous linguistic pothole.
Exactly. The text states the rule clearly. He becomes himself. The example returns to the kitchen. He cut himself. But right beneath that, the source provides an explicit, almost desperate warning for learners. Do not, under any circumstances, say his self.
And this is a moment where you have to feel deep sympathy for anyone trying to learn English. Because when a language learner, or honestly, when a native-speaking toddler says his self, they are not making a stupid mistake. They are actually behaving with perfect, rigorous logic. They are identifying a pattern that the English language established, and they are following it to its natural conclusion.
Wait, I want to make sure I'm following the exact pattern you mean. How does his self make logical sense?
Look back at the first few pronouns we discussed. How did we build them? We took a possessive adjective and attached the word self. My is possessive, it becomes myself. Your is possessive, it becomes yourself. Down in the plurals, our is possessive, it becomes ourselves.
Right.
The human brain is fundamentally a pattern recognition machine. It craves consistency. So when the brain arrives at the third-person masculine, it naturally reaches for the masculine possessive adjective, which is his, and attaches self. The result is his self. It is mathematically and logically flawless based on the established rule.
Oh, I see it now. Myself.
Yeah.
Yourself. His self.
It lines up perfectly in a neat little column.
But English is notoriously hostile to consistency.
Yeah.
Right at the third-person singular, the language arbitrarily abandons the possessive pattern and switches to using the object pronoun instead. Him is an object pronoun, and we force it to become himself. We do the exact same arbitrary switch with the plural they.
We don't use their selves.
Yep.
Exactly. We don't use the possessive theirselves, which would make complete sense. We use the object themselves. So the strict warning in this text exists precisely because to speak correct English, you must actively violate the logical pattern your brain naturally wants to build.
It's a great reminder of how deeply arbitrary the rules we accept as natural truly are. And it also highlights why guides like this one are so necessary. You can't just logic your way through it. You have to be warned about the invisible traps. But what I appreciate about this specific source material is that it doesn't just leave these arbitrary grammar rules floating in a void of academic charts. It actively grounds them in a narrative. There is a storytime segment right in the middle of the text, specifically designed to show all of this mechanical grammar operating under pressure. The story is titled The Clumsy Chef.
It operates as a sort of practical stress test for the concepts we've just unpacked. It moves the pronouns out of the laboratory and into the wild.
Let's walk you through this narrative, because it genuinely encapsulates everything we've dissected so far, and it does it with surprising narrative economy. The story introduces us to a fictional character named Lukas. The text sets the scene very deliberately. Lukas is in the kitchen, and he wants to cook dinner by himself. We're going to dig deeply into that specific idiom, by himself, in the final segment of our deep dive. But for now, the vital baseline fact is his isolation. He is alone. And then the text initiates an escalating sequence of disasters. It reads, he picks up a knife. Ouch, he cuts himself. This is immediately followed by, then he turns on the stove. Ouch, he burns himself.
The author of this guide is pulling off a very clever structural trick here. They are utilizing the vocabulary of physical injury from the very first segment to actively reinforce the grammar of the mirror rule in the second segment. We are watching the theoretical math play out as physical comedy. Lukas is the subject generating the action. The knife and the stove are merely the instruments. But Lukas is ultimately the inescapable object of the destruction. The action loops right back onto him over and over again. He is trapped in his own reflexive syntax.
He really is just a one-man chaos loop. But then the narrative introduces a disruption. A second character, Anna, runs into the kitchen, drawn by the yelling, and she delivers this fantastic, exasperated line, "Lukas, look at yourself. You are a mess."
I want you to pay close attention to that specific piece of dialogue because it is incredibly important to the philosophical framework of the text. Anna uses the reflexive pronoun yourself, but she does not use to describe a physical action like cutting or burning. She uses it to demand visual and psychological self-reckoning. She is literally commanding Lukas to apply the mirror rule to his own state of being. She is asking him stop being the chaotic subject of the action, step outside of himself, and become the objective observer of his own catastrophic consequences.
And the intervention actually works. The text shows Lukas immediately shifting from experiencing physical pain to accepting psychological accountability. He stops yelling ouch and replies, "I blame myself. I am a bad cook." The vocabulary of self-blame that we analyzed earlier comes full circle. He has entirely internalized the clumsiness.
He has accepted the grim reality of the closed loop. He acknowledges that the subject who picked up the knife and the object who is currently bleeding are one and the same. He is taking complete ownership of his own failure. But crucially, the author doesn't let the story end in that state of isolated despair. Which brings us to what I consider the most vital narrative and grammatical pivot in the entire source text.
The pivot changes everything. Anna, instead of leaving him to his misery, smiles at him and says, "Don't worry, we can help each other. You chop, I cook." And the story concludes with the line, they smile at each other. Now, the dinner is safe.
That narrative pivot is an absolute masterpiece of grammatical transition. In 3 short sentences, the story moves completely out of the realm of reflexive pronouns, which we have firmly established represent isolation, self-inflicted injury, and internalized blame, and steps into the entirely new realm of reciprocal pronouns. The introduction of the phrase each other fundamentally alters the geometry of the situation. It shatters the closed, isolated loop of Lukas's chaos and replaces it with an open, collaborative exchange.
Alters the geometry. I love that phrasing because the text itself leans heavily into spatial relationships to explain this transition. This brings us perfectly to the next major conceptual block in our deep dive, the geometry of interaction. The text demands that we understand the profound difference between reflexive pronouns and reciprocal pronouns. We spent all this time talking about the rigid mechanics of the mirror rule. Now we need to talk about the mechanics of eye contact.
Exactly. If we establish that the reflexive pronoun is a person staring into a mirror, the reciprocal pronoun, represented by the phrase each other, is the act of making eye contact with someone across a crowded room. The source material provides a very clear, almost architectural visual breakdown to help learners distinguish between the two states.
Let's lay out that geometry for you, the listener, right now. Try to visualize this. The text compares 2 highly specific sentences. The first sentence represents the reflexive geometry we already know. They look at themselves. The text breaks this down by explaining that person A looks at person A and person B looks at person B. Picture 2 people standing side by side in a bathroom, both staring straight ahead into a large vanity mirror. They are physically next to each other, but structurally, the action stays entirely in its own lane.
That's the perfect visualization. Even though the grammatical subject of the sentence is plural, the word they, the action remains profoundly, almost aggressively isolated. There is absolutely no crossing of paths. The energy of the verb to look travels straight forward into the silver backing of the mirror and bounces straight back to the singular originator. Person A is completely blind to person B.
But then the text offers the alternative, the reciprocal geometry. They look at each other, the dynamic completely shatters the mirror.
Because here, the equation is no longer the closed loop of subject equals object. It has become a cross-pollination. Subject A directs their action towards subject B, while subject B simultaneously directs their action towards subject A. The arrows of action intersect in the space between them. It is an active exchange. The text explicitly uses the concept of eye contact to illustrate this, because eye contact is the ultimate reciprocal act. You cannot make eye contact with yourself in a way that connects you to the broader human experience. You can only do it with another distinct entity. The phrase, each other, acts as the grammatical bridge between two separate islands of self.
To really hammer this conceptual geometry home, the source material includes an interactive game segment toward the end of the guide. And one of the case studies in this game features a scenario I think everyone listening will instantly recognize: Romeo and Juliet. The text lays out the premise very simply. Romeo loves Juliet and Juliet loves Romeo. Therefore, the grammatical conclusion the text demands is they love each other.
It is the ultimate universally understood expression of reciprocal action. The emotion, the verb, flows equally and simultaneously in both directions across the divide between the two individuals. It is the perfect intersecting geometry.
So what does this all mean? Why are we dissecting the spatial geometry of a teenage romance so intensely? We're doing it because right after establishing this reciprocal rule, the source text drops another one of those massive flashing warning signs for the learner. It delivers a strict, uncompromising rule. You must never say "we love us."
And this, in my opinion, is perhaps the most profound linguistic mistake we can analyze in this entire deep dive. Why is "we love us" so viscerally wrong? I don't just mean grammatically incorrect, I mean conceptually repulsive. Let's apply the geometry we just spent time learning. If you say "we love us," you are taking the reflexive mirror rule and applying it to a plural group. You are stating that the group, acting as a single amalgamated entity, is entirely focused on adoring its own collective reflection.
It sounds incredibly narcissistic. Think about couples who insist on sitting on the exact same side of the booth at an empty restaurant, just sort of radiating self-satisfaction. That is the physical embodiment of "we love us."
It is. And the tragedy of that phrasing is that it completely misses the interpersonal exchange that makes love or any mutual action meaningful in the first place. "We love us" implies a shared impenetrable ego. It suggests that person A and person B aren't actually looking at each other, they are just standing shoulder to shoulder, patting themselves on the back. It entirely lacks the fundamental vulnerability required by the phrase "each other."
You'd say each other requires vulnerability. How so?
Because the reciprocal pronoun requires you to project your action outward, across the divide, and trust that the other person will project theirs back toward you to complete the circuit. It requires faith in the intersection. "We love us" doesn't require faith, it's a closed system. "We love us" is a fortress you build to keep the world out. "We love each other" is a bridge you build to connect two worlds together.
A fortress versus a bridge. That is an amazing way to look at it. It really drives home the point that choosing the wrong pronoun in English doesn't just make you sound a little clunky or unnatural to a native speaker. It fundamentally alters the human meaning of your sentence. It changes the entire relationship dynamic you were trying to describe.
You aren't just failing a grammar test, you are misrepresenting the psychological reality of the interaction.
Okay, as we move into the final stretches of our source material, the text shifts gears one last time. It moves into what it labels an advanced concept. We step away from the direct action of verbs like cutting, burning, looking, loving, and we look at an idiom. The text focuses on the construction of the preposition by, followed by a reflexive pronoun. So phrases like by myself, by yourself, by herself, and so on.
This represents a crucial evolution in the learner's journey through this text. Up until now, we have been obsessed with the target of the verb, who is receiving the action. But with this idiom, we are no longer talking about the action itself. We are talking about the environment or the condition in which the action occurs. The text defines the structure by plus reflexive as simply meaning alone or without help.
The examples the guide provides are very clear everyday scenarios. First, I live by myself, which translates directly to I live alone. And second, I did the homework by myself, meaning nobody helped me. The text also provides a great, highly common synonym phrase to help learners grasp the nuance: on my own.
What I find so interesting here is how the reflexive pronoun has been completely repurposed. It is no longer the tragic object of an action, like our clumsy chef Lukas cutting himself in a panic. It has been transformed into a statement of condition. It describes a state of physical or intellectual isolation, yes, but unlike the chaotic isolation of clumsiness, this isolation is often deeply intentional and frankly empowering. "I did the homework by myself" isn't a complaint about loneliness, it is a fierce declaration of competence.
It really is. It is claiming total, unadulterated ownership of the achievement. It's saying, the credit belongs entirely to the subject. But true to form, the source material can't let the learner go without one final test. In the interactive game at the end of the guide, the character Anna gives Lukas a scenario. She says, I did the homework alone. I did it by upwechting. And Lukas answers correctly and enthusiastically, by myself. But the text explicitly notes in parentheses as a final warning, not by me.
This raises an important question, an almost philosophical question about how English constructs agency. Why can't we say by me? And honestly, if we dig deeper, why do we even need the word by in the first place? Think about the core of the sentence. If I simply say, I did the homework, the fact that I was the one who did it is already firmly established by the subject I.
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
I did the homework is a complete syntactically sound sentence. If you did it, we assume you did it.
Exactly. So adding the phrase by myself isn't strictly necessary for the core grammar of the sentence to function. We add it purely for emphasis, to highlight the lack of external assistance. But if we were to say, I did the homework by me, the sentence collapses into absurdity. As we discussed way back at the beginning of this deep dive, me is an external object pronoun. Saying an action was done by me sounds like you were describing the actions of a third party. It sounds like you were a passive bystander observing your own accomplishment. You are separating your sense of agency from your core identity.
It sounds like you hired yourself as an independent contractor to do your own homework. Yes, the homework was completed by me. I'll send you the invoice.
Exactly. It creates this bizarre, bureaucratic alienation from your own life. But by utilizing the reflexive pronoun, by myself, you fuse your agency directly back into your identity. The preposition by acts almost like a physical boundary line, a fence you build around the action. You are standing inside that fence, pointing to the finished homework and saying, inside this boundary, there was no one else. It was only me. It transforms a simple, tiny object pronoun into an incredibly powerful declaration of self-sufficiency and independence.
It is genuinely amazing how much heavy conceptual lifting that tiny word by does when it gets paired with myself. It completely alters the landscape of the sentence. It takes you from a statement of fact to a statement of pride. Well, as we look back over the massive amount of linguistic and philosophical terrain we've covered today, it is wild to think that all of this depth, all of these intricacies, came from a relatively short intermediate B1 grammar guide.
It really is impressive.
We started in the kitchen, exploring the highly physical and deeply psychological vocabulary of clumsiness, dropping plates, and the heavy burden of self-blame. We decoded the rigid, unyielding mathematics of the mirror rule, learning how reflexive pronouns force the subject and object to unify into a single, cohesive identity, and why the language traps us when we try to logically say his self.
The great linguistic trap.
We watched Lukas, our tragic, clumsy chef, get trapped in a chaotic cycle of isolated injury, until Anna arrived to force a moment of self-reflection and transition the narrative into the safety of mutual cooperation. We spent time untangling the complex spatial geometry of interaction, proving why each other builds a vulnerable, necessary bridge between two people, while we love us just constructs a narcissistic fortress. And finally, we examined how the simple idiom by myself repurposes the reflexive pronoun from an object of pain into a fierce declaration of independence.
I think the core takeaway from this entire deep dive into the source material is a newfound respect for the invisible architecture of the words we use every day. English grammar doesn't just arbitrarily throw words around to make sentences sound pretty. It uses these specific, highly calibrated, microscopic tools to draw strict, necessary boundaries around human experience. The grammar forces us to constantly clarify exactly who we are, what we are actively doing to ourselves, and precisely how we are choosing to connect with the people around us.
It maps our relationships to the world and to ourselves. And that leaves you, listening right now, with a final thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. We've seen how the English language draws such a hard, unforgiving structural line between doing something to ourselves, like looking in a mirror and taking the blame, and doing something to each other, like making eye contact and sharing the load. So how might actively mastering this seemingly simple, everyday grammar subtly change the way you actually view your own responsibilities? Does clearly defining the boundary of what is my fault versus the open space of how we can help each other change the way you balance your obligations to your own independence against your obligations to your community? It is absolutely something to think about the next time you find yourself alone in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, trying not to be clumsy. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We always appreciate you taking the time to explore these complex concepts with us, pulling apart the invisible threads of the things we take for granted. Take care of yourself, look out for each other, and we will see you next time.